The land, the animals, and the people. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast.
All right, happy to have with me today on the podcast the Oregon director for the Western Watersheds Project. He has been with the project since 2020. When he first started as the Idaho director, he's now the Oregon director and a fellow SUNY alum, so I can relate, which is great. Someone who's from the upper part of New York State. He is Adam Bronstein. Adam, it's great to meet you, and thank you for the quick turnaround. I know that you're heading out after today, basically. So thank you for coming on and talking the Roadless Rule with me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks so much for reaching out to us. And the Roadless Rule is very important to us at Western Watersheds Project and our members, and also the public at large. It's a very, very popular rule. Yeah.
So just before we get into the meat and potatoes of the Roadless Rule, just give everyone a brief background about yourself, how you grew up. I know the Adirondack Mountains were a big part of your, I guess, your childhood or your formative years, and what exactly the Oregon director does for Western Watersheds and how you came into that position.
Sure. Yeah. I grew up in Syracuse, New York. And as you mentioned, I went to a SUNY school, the College of Environmental Science and Forestry, SUNY ESF. It was actually the same school that Bob Marshall went to as one of the founders of the Wilderness Society back in the day. I was a part of the Bob Marshall Hiking Club, and my friends and I would go up to the Adirondack Mountains all the time to go hiking. And I almost actually I was on academic probation for my first half a year. I pulled out of that strong, but we got up to the Adirondacks a lot, and I cut my teeth on wilderness, and the Adirondacks are a very, very special place. So that's really where my love for wildlands was fostered. And the Adirondack Park is about 6 million acres. 2 million acres of that or so are wilderness, actually protected under the New York State Constitution. So it was an incredible opportunity to grow up with the Adirondacks there at my backyard, and it really made me who I am today. The Western Watersheds Project, we work across the West and all the Western states, and our mission is to protect and restore Western watersheds and wildlife, and we have a particular focus on the negative impacts of domestic livestock grazing on these ecosystems. So like you mentioned, I'm the Oregon director, so I focus on the public lands here in Oregon, both the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service lands, also Fish and Wildlife, which is under the Department of the Interior. So we're all, spread out, many thousands of square miles and about an inch deep across our states. But it's a pleasure and an honor to be working with Western Watersheds Project.
When you just talk about a little bit of those, what the impact was for hiking in nature for you, because you are a public lands hunter and angler still to this day. So obviously, what did you take from those early experiences, and why has the environment had the impact that it has had on you to go into this part of your career and to protect these wild places and spaces? As you said, we can learn what we can through books and scholastics, but being out in the actual wilderness itself and understanding what that does for us, what were the effects for you as you were growing up?
I mean, it was transformational. I can't speak enough to the importance of those wildlands to who I was as a young person growing up and how they shaped me today. I started to come to realize that wilderness was actually the real world. The world we have around us, civilization, it's manufactured. I do enjoy the luxuries and the comforts of modern civilization. But wilderness allows us to really step into that real world. It's where wildlife live. It's where natural processes unfold in front of us. And when we just slow down a little bit and we get to really tune in and tap into that awesome power of nature, and I forgot who said it, but in wilderness is the preservation of the world. And it really is. So, I started out as a mountain climber. I did a lot of rock and ice climbing, and my buddies and I, we would back peaks and climb, very fast. And I started to slow down after a while, and that's where hunting and angling really came in for me. It's a slow pursuit. It's more introspective and it's more observational. So it's kind of been a transition for me from going real hard and fast to really slowing down and just enjoying these wild places. And it's I can't express enough just how important having wilderness was to me, growing up and becoming the person that I am today, wanting to protect these places. If it wasn't for the Adirondacks, I most certainly would not be, in this career today.
Talk real fast about, and I say that, but I want you to talk about that, just that slowing down, because it's such a beautiful way of you describing it, that it was kind of playing, I don't want to say fast and loose, but fast in one part when you're talking about hiking and climbing, and then you ratcheted back and took things slower. What does it mean to really take the wilderness in, at least from your perspective, and maybe some of the stories you share with other folks that learn about your background? Why is it so important to slow down, to be in tune and ground yourself into the natural world? And what does that do to you physiologically? If you can explain just from your perspective, what does that do?
Well, it's like a fresh of breath air. Even just stepping past that wilderness sign, I just feel like I'm stepping again into that real world, and just getting to be present with all of this happening around you. That's self-willed. I mean, that's what wild means, right? Is self-willed. So to imagine yourself as being a part of that natural community is so powerful. It's something that is larger than ourselves. We live in the Garden of Eden right now. I'm not a religious person, but we live in this incredible place out west here, and the East certainly has its fair share of wildlands too. But out west, we really have an honor and privilege to live near so many wildlands and roadless lands. Wilderness is a type of roadless lands, and I know we'll be talking about that. But the slowing down is really so critical, because it allows that introspective. It allows that the self-growth, the ability to start to disentangle ourselves from all the distractions of the world, and to place yourself squarely in this really long time and period of life and evolution, and that we get to observe it for any moment is just incredible. So it just makes me feel like I'm a part of something. I know as humans, we want to be a part of something larger than ourselves. And we can find that in the wild. We can find that in wilderness. And all the components, all the parts of nature are there for us to enjoy and to be able to observe. And it's just, it's a real privilege to be an American and to have this resource for us to access, but also to be able to extend certain rights of nature to these ecosystems and the wildlife and the wolves and all of these important predators and carnivores and the whole suite of life that occupies our wild places.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's something that it's almost as though sometimes humans were looking for, like as you mentioned, to be a part of something larger, when in reality, we are part of something larger. We were born out of the earth, and we've been traversing this land, this globe that's in the big span of the universe for a long time, not as long as some of the creatures that are still here. So it's just we're already part of it. And it's like, how do we get back to finding balance and realizing that if you just put 2 feet in the ground, you may actually realize, oh, I remember this place maybe from some other form of maybe some other cosmic dust that came through. Just a little woo-woo there, but I feel you that like that's something innate or maybe instinctual in us that we've sort of lost.
Have you spent some time in wilderness areas? Have you gotten to explore?
Absolutely.
What do you feel when you're in those places?
For me, it's really a sense of calm, and another part of home for me. I wanted to grow up and be a vet as a kid, and I think that was sort of the track for anybody I can't say anybody, for most people that want to work with animals or enjoy animals or write reports on animals, is they maybe think veterinary school or something like that is the only track forward, or zoology for that matter. And so when I found the sanctuary at Wolf Connection, it just brought a whole new perspective on not just wolves and wolf dogs and figuring out that species in and of itself and the importance of that and education and information, but as you said, slowing down from the rigors of regular life and then sitting in the creek bed that we have, watching the water just sort of pass through, taking a time to meditate, even if it's for a few minutes. It doesn't have to be a huge span of time, but those are places for me, or hiking up some of the mountains that are on the property, to be able to see the large expanse of where we are. And that's just a small microcosm of, say, the Angeles National Forest. You could go miles in either direction and see something completely different. So for me, those are things that I get to take in multiple times a week. And there's always something new, or there's favorite spots, obviously, but there's always something that I can take that's a little bit different, or see a behavior that's a little bit different. And then I can try and integrate that into my life and say, how is this wolf dog figuring or dealing with this situation? And why can't I use some of those tools that I'm learning from them? Or how are the trees swaying and things like that? So it's really a good, I don't even want to say escape anymore. It's really a partnership with the land and with the animals that we take care of.
Yeah, I think that's great. I really like how you said, it feels like going home, because it feels like home to me. And, I tend to get a little emotional about this stuff because the threats that we face now with this rollback and, just the attacks on public lands right now, it's, it feels like my home is being attacked. And it's, I just can't imagine, living in a world without these wild places to go to. I don't know who I would be. I don't know who we would be as a people. It's a very scary proposition to even think about.
Yeah, and I think if I look at the positive angle of this, and when you talk about public land, to me, it shows that there is common ground to be found with a lot of different sections of our population. To me, that was the beautiful part, not that the lands are being attacked, but how many different groups or many different types of organizations or people rose together and said, no, these are our public lands. You cannot just sell them off for whatever the reasons that you're looking for. So as divisive as things may be, there is something unique with the way the land, as much as it's been mined or drilled or forested or logged or whatever it may be, and the animals that have been extirpated, and are still under duress at this point, the land still can bring humans together to say, no, this is ours, and we are here to protect it for future generations to come. So while there's so much, as you say, negative or not even negative, but just a lot of things under attack, at least there's a bright spot that people came together, we did this, and hopefully that momentum goes forward with certain things like this. And we talk about the Roadless Rule. Tell everybody out there too, why or what the Roadless Rule is, when it started, and what it really protects through the scope of the United States, the contiguous United States, at least in North America.
Sure. So, there's a lot of background to the, recognition of our roadless wildlands and our primitive areas. There's a lot of history there, and we can go over some of that.
Sure.
But, to jump to 2001, that kind of leaves a pretty large gap. But basically, in 2001, President Clinton, on his way out just before leaving office, I believe it was on January 12th, he signed an executive order creating, essentially putting in place the Roadless Rule. So it's called the Roadless Area Conservation Act. And it protected, to a large degree, about 58.5 million acres of what are called inventoried roadless areas on our national forest systems. And these are some of the last large tracts of public lands where road building is highly restricted, and most logging was disallowed. There are some loopholes, and I think we actually should talk about that. There's also livestock grazing that occurs in a lot of these roadless areas too. So basically, the policy was put in place to try to keep these places intact, and it was a very, very popular move by the Clinton administration. Overwhelming public support. About 95% of comments were in favor of supporting the roadless rule. This was like the largest showing of comments too, I think, for a public comment period. 1.6 million comments came in, the largest ever. There was also a concern about this backlog of maintenance for road building, over $8 billion at that time. And this was one of the areas where Clinton was able to argue that it's actually fiscally irresponsible and damaging to keep building roads, and especially roads we can't maintain. So, this is a conservation legacy for Clinton. Chief Forest Service Mike Dombeck presented it as a landmark conservation measure, and putting it on par with creating of the national park systems or our wilderness areas. But again, this was done through administrative fiat, and this was not, an act of Congress.
So when you describe where these lands are protected, because I think you sent me a map. If I'm incorrect, I'll try and look through some of the links you sent. But this spreads all the way across. I know there's a lot of it in the western part of the United States, but I believe are some of the Adirondacks in there as well, some of the part of the eastern part. So talk to those who are listening where this impacts, because it probably impacts someone who's listening in every part of the country when they listen to this episode at least.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Adirondack Park is actually a state park. So those wilderness areas are under the New York State Constitution. But you have the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont. You have the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. Those all have inventoried roadless areas that came under protection from this roadless rule. I know in North Carolina there are some large roadless areas that are in the multiple tens of thousands of acres. So all throughout the East, you do have pockets of inventoried roadless, but they really start getting larger once you go west of the Mississippi. There is a statistic, and I'll read it here. Over 61% of all IRAs in the contiguous U.S. lie within 100 meters of existing protected areas. So these are national parks and wilderness areas. And more than 93% of them lie within 10 kilometers, or the scientists like to use, the metric system. But basically, these roadless areas buffer wilderness areas, and they're highly concentrated, in these more backcountry areas. They provide really important buffers to those wilderness, but also create, stepping stones for wildlife to migrate. So they really form a large core of our current protections on our Forest Service lands today.
And it gives corridors too for a lot of these, because we talked about obviously impacting all sorts of wildlife, and this obviously would, if this were to be rescinded, we're talking about making even more of a patchwork landscape, because we've seen that where certain public lands were trying to be sold off, and the more patchwork we have, there are no clear corridors, not just for predators to go through, but the ungulate herds, the birds to migrate, any of the other species that are using these public lands and these IRAs to navigate throughout the country. So the impact of that obviously goes far beyond, and also the flora that are there. And talking about, like you said, logging and different things. What are sort of the major, I guess, threats that, this is? Because you say they butt up against, is this in the same argument as public land sell-offs? Is this sort of in line with that what's trying to happen? And why is that so? Why is that they're so different, but they're the same in that way?
Yeah, there's a few questions in there, but let me, first say that the extraction agenda is absolutely out there, right?
Right.
I think that the public land sell-offs push was really a distraction because, there's so much that the Trump administration has done through his executive orders and also this Roadless Rule rescission. It's all tied in back to extraction. So it presents a lot of dangers. I'll read a quote by William O. Douglas that he wrote in his Wilderness Bill of Rights. It's a treatise that he wrote. And one of my favorite quotes is he says, "A road is a dagger placed in the heart of wilderness." And I'll just read the opening
Sure.
first couple sentences here. He says, "The march of men and machines continues apace into what little is left of America's once great and vast wilderness. With it comes cut trees, power lines, drained swamps, roads, dams, and a variety of refuse, resulting in an almost totally irrevocable change in the land and wildlife. The machines may leave, but the men and scars do not. The net result is less and less wilderness each year." So roads really do cut at the heart of these wildlands. Once the roads go in, then the logs start coming out, then the cows start going in, then the mines will follow, all the off-road vehicle use. The people will flood into these areas with their machines, and as you know, this all has incredible deleterious impacts to wildlife, species like grizzly bear and Canada lynx and wolves to some extent, but their prey in particular, like elk, which is their main prey. These animals need security habitat. So not only do roads and development destroy their habitat, but it also displaces wildlife as well. So it just, once roads start going into areas, everything basically collapses all around it. So it's very, very critical to keep these wildlands free of roads and to keep them protected. And we need greater protections, and I hope we can talk about that at some point.
Yeah, talk about the protections. Like, are there weak points within the roadless rule that make it so that these actions are even being able to be discussed at this point? What are some of the, I know you mentioned loopholes, I think, at the very beginning. What are some of those things that you're talking about? You sent over some great things, but discuss sort of, like you said, the protections that are needed more for this rule, and why is it under attack at this specific moment, and that people are able to go at it this way?
Well, it's under attack by the Trump administration and the timber industry, but all the other industries are just chomping at the bit too. Whether it's the off-road vehicle industry, the livestock industry, mining, oil and gas. All these industries want to be able to get into these places because it's really the best of what's left, right? It's sort of the undeveloped wilderness that we have. The roadless area rule was a good first step, but I think one of the glaring issues is that it continued to allow motorized recreation and even expansion into these areas. So it allowed an industry to really take a foothold. You might know that in designated wilderness, you can't have any motorized or mechanized transportation. So roadless areas, from the start, we have an uphill battle because of that. I think that was one of the big mistakes, with enacting that roadless rule. It is an administrative rule, like we talked about. It's not protected by congressional fiat. You have what's called the Roadless Area Conservation Act, which was introduced this June of 2025, and it would codify the existing roadless rule into law. But there are, like I said, there are loopholes, and they're being exploited right now. So it's really not enough. So I think as conservationists, we can talk about how important it is to keep the existing protections in place, but we also need to talk about further and future protections. So right now, the Roadless Rule does allow some timber harvesting, development of valid claims of minerals, grazing of livestock, and of course, like I mentioned, off-highway vehicle use. There's a report by the Friends of the Clearwater, and I'll just read the opening part of their report. Virtually unknown to the general public, we found the exceptions written into these rules, this is the Roadless Rule, were being exploited by the U.S. Forest Service, authorizing the development of roughly 39,000 acres of wild roadless lands in Montana and 18,000 acres in Idaho. Mostly this happened because loopholes allow industrial activities promoted as quote-unquote habitat restoration, a justification for logging by the Forest Service, and this has become ubiquitous. Use of these loopholes has accelerated since 2010. So the Roadless Rule has really slowed down and prevented logging in a lot of places, but it's also happening. And there are loopholes to exploit, and a lot of it's under the guise of wildfire mitigation and fanning the fear of wildfire, which is really the pretext for the Trump administration, as they talk about the need to repeal the Roadless Rule. They say it's so we can get in there and manage to mitigate and to preclude wildfire, which is just the science does just not support that any longer. It's a big red flag.
So I was going to ask that too, and you already answered it. Is that there's sort of bringing up these issues because we've seen massive wildfires increase over the past, I would say, probably decade or so. At least, I mean, here in California, obviously, we've seen it, and of course, some other states. So these are the issues that they're bringing up to say this doesn't allow us to do forest management, and that if we're not able to get in there to log the timber or do whatever it needs to be done, the wildfires will only get worse, and this land will get scorched to some degree. Is that sort of accurate of what they're stating as to why this needs to be removed?
Yeah. Let me read a couple of quotes from their press release. This is from the June 23rd press release from Brooke Rollins, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. She said, "This rule is overly restrictive and poses real harm to millions of acres of our national forests. Once again, President Trump is removing absurd obstacles to common sense management of our natural resources by rescinding the overly restrictive Roadless Rule. And it is abundantly clear that properly managing our forests preserves them from the devastating fires and allows future generations of Americans to enjoy and reap the benefits of this great land." Well, I got to tell you, Brooke, fires are natural. Stand replacing fires are natural. These have been going on for millennia. We are certainly in a very hot and dry period of time right now. But for many, many millions of years, these forests have evolved and adapted and have been, hotter than they are today. We're actually still in a fire deficit. The science seems to be pointing that we're in a fire deficit. If we're talking about protecting communities, Dr. Jack Cohen, a USDA fire scientist who has since left the agency, he did a lot of real-world studies around how structures combust. And basically, if you have defensible space within 100 feet of a structure and you're using, fire-safe building materials, and you don't have, you've got like 5 feet of concrete or rocks around your structure, your dog doors are closed, that kind of thing, your vents, it's highly, highly unlikely that your house is going to burn or your structure is going to burn. So instead of putting our efforts towards hardening our communities and our homes, creating defensible space, the logging industry is using all of these excuses and perpetuating these false myths about wildfire and these narratives to direct our focus into the backcountry, to log and to introduce more livestock grazing. They say that livestock grazing reduces the fuels out there, and can prevent and mitigate wildfires. But that's just, it's much more complicated than that. We certainly can influence fire behavior with our management, there is no doubt. But there's also a lot of studies that show that fires spread slower and they burn less intensely in roadless lands and wilderness lands and national park lands. Because when you start logging, you open up the canopy, you open up the understory, you allow further wind penetration, the drying of the vegetation and the soils and the sun to get through. And really, in these periods of intense fire weather, which is really when these fires will explode and become these mega fires of over 100,000 acres, you have these conditions that it doesn't matter if you're doing a little bit of, if you're doing some thinning or logging to reduce those quote unquote fuels, these fires are still going to blow up. And those are the ones that are really, dangerous to communities. So the end of the story is it's just meant to stoke fear and to provide cover for the logging industry and for the livestock industry and other industries to get in there to extract, and it leaves us all more vulnerable and our communities left unprotected.
The Wolf Connection podcast is now sponsored by our new partner, Jacques-Marie Mage. This LA-based brand is known for their limited edition, handcrafted eyewear and luxury goods, but also for their stewardship program, which supports various nonprofits and individuals who are working to protect a future for wild wolves.
So when we look at this, because we've talked about the fire issue a little bit here on the podcast as well, talking with different entities or different individuals, when you're talking about clearing, because most of the argument, I believe, goes to clearing the underbrush, which is the fuels, as you mentioned before, right? Is we have to clear the fuels away, so this way, we leave the trees intact. But if we're taking the trees away, isn't some of that fuel also food for these species that are going through? So if we get rid of all of that, they now have to find a different section of these forests to not only feed and graze and migrate through. We could be harming the larger herds or packs at this point, whether we know it or not, when we're talking about mitigating fire. Is that a false argument or something?
No.
Where do you stand on that? Yeah.
No, absolutely. That is a huge, huge concern. When we were talking about wildfires just a minute, or just now, we were just talking about, the human safety element. But the ecological impacts from the mowing, the mastication, the thinning, the logging they're extensive. And when you clear out the brush, you're disturbing those soils. You're destroying native bee colonies. You're destroying all these shrubs that mule deer and other rodents like to use or need to use. The dead and down wood, the snags in the forests. Forests are supposed to be messy, naturally. And these are the conditions that these species evolved under. So when we're altering the state of these ecosystems into this,
manicured, basically, yeah.
Manicured garden tree farms, you're losing that complexity. And then you start getting these ecological collapses, essentially, locally, of species. And then you just get all the disturbance, and then, again, pushing out the wildlife, and it becomes highly destructive to these ecosystems and all the wildlife that are out there.
I want to go back too, because I didn't hit it before, but when we talk about recreation too, because most people, I think, believe, and to myself, I think as you're younger and you're growing up and we're hiking and biking and things like that, we don't think that recreation takes a toll on these places as well, but they do. And so what are the ways, does the Roadless Rule help mitigate some of the outdoor recreation usage of some of these places? Or is it sort of baked into, I guess, the nature of the text that, hiking, biking, things like that are sort of left alone, and we're talking about more deeper concerns when we talk about mining and drilling and logging, things like that? What are the impacts of outdoor recreation, and how does the Roadless Rule impact that, if it does at all?
Yeah, the roadless rule is very kind to outdoor recreation, I guess you
Okay.
could say. There's established climbing routes and bolted climbing routes inside of these IRAs. There's motorized vehicle use, motorized trails, there's mountain bike trails, there's hiking trails. So there's the full suite of recreation that happens in these places. And like you had mentioned, we're learning more and more about the impacts to wildlife that we as recreationists are causing to wildlife. And some species are more sensitive than others. Grizzly bears are highly sensitive. Wolverines are highly sensitive. Lynx, elk are highly sensitive. Deer, certainly. And there's a lot of studies and empirical data around this, looking at the dispersion of various animals along different trails and different uses. So once you start getting trails that, are in a high density in an area, you get very little security habitat for species. Even our scent in an area can, scare off certain animals. There was one study, and I don't want to butcher this, but I think it was up in British Columbia, where some people visited a very remote forest once during the year, and there was a noticeable decline in the visitation of certain animal species. So just our scent and our presence in an area does impact wildlife. And of course, when you have constant, traffic, like I know of some wildlife cameras that were put up in the Gallatin Range in Montana, for instance, and on some high-use trails. And this is inside of a wilderness study area. And there were hundreds and hundreds of dirt bikes and mountain bikes that were captured. And I think one deer, so one animal was captured on this one wildlife camera, like about a mile in from a very popular hiking trail. Other trails that, see less visitation and less use in the Gallatin Range, there were, elk and deer and wolves that were observed there. So, but we don't know the full extent of the stress that we put on wildlife. There's another example out of Vail, Colorado, where hikers actually decimated an entire elk herd. They would go up and disturb the elk during the calving season, and this entire herd of elk collapsed just due to hiking. So, all of the uses have great impacts, and we see a lot of that inside of our roadless areas as well.
So what are the ways that you yourself or other groups are looking to restructure sort of the protections in the roadless rule on this aspect in particular? Because there's going to be, I'm sure, some pushback from communities or folks that outdoor recreate, and that is their escape to, from whatever it is, or it's just how they spend their time, whether it's hiking or climbing or whatever it may be. So what are the ways that there could be sort of enforcement or redirection of those activities to keep these areas more ecologically intact and a little bit more safe, and give even a little bit more of a buffer zone or some space to certain areas where elk herds are calving? I know when I was back in New York and I would go to the beach, they would corner off certain areas where there were, birds that were
plovers,
specifically nesting. Yeah. So when you could not go in those areas at all. So what are some of the ways or some of the protections that you're looking to sort of build up or build upon the roadless rule a little bit more so that those activities don't impact as much?
Yeah, Western Watersheds Project doesn't have a specific set of policies around this. We're mostly focused on livestock grazing issues,
Sure.
but we did touch on some of the overarching issues and some of the loopholes that we would like to see closed around roadless areas. But I could certainly, give a few ideas around recreation that I would personally like to see change.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead. What do you think? Because you outdoor recreate, more than most. So, because you're out there hunting and angling and doing all these things. So it's not, I'm not saying, motorized vehicles, but you're out there enough.
This isn't the position of Western Watersheds Project per se, but, I'd like to see motorized use highly restricted across a lot of our public lands, and mechanized mountain biking is also something I think that could be reined in certain places. Particularly when you start thinking about gaining greater protections for roadless areas, because in order to become designated as wilderness, you have to start precluding those uses. And I know it can be hard for some people to hear, and I know that there are wilderness supporters who are motorized enthusiasts and mountain bikers, but it takes a bit of sacrifice there to start closing some of these trails and to allow them to potentially become included in the wilderness preservation system. And again, in order to do that, you have to start reining in some of these uses. Of course, once some of these uses become established and you have a constituency that's there using them, it becomes a lot more difficult politically to start reining those in. But some of these loopholes around road building and logging for fire mitigation and quote unquote habitat restoration, these loopholes just they need to be closed. We have to let our wildlands be wild and to undergo their natural processes undisturbed by our machines and our industrial mindset. Basically we need to start backing off a bit from these places. So there's actually a red line version of the Roadless Area Conservation Act that some of my colleagues have worked on, that Western Watersheds Project supports, that would close these loopholes and would gain greater protections for roadless areas. They don't necessarily have to become wilderness, but we want to see, very similar protections be offered to these places so that wildlife and ecosystems can persist and stay healthy.
So when they discuss habitat mitigation or sort of habitat restoration, what are some of the activities that are being stated that it would help if we went in and mined and grazed and logged? What are the impacts that are being stated that the Roadless Rule is stopping them from doing that would actually help the environment from their perspective, as opposed to what would actually be harming it? What's the difference there, so people can understand?
Yeah, well, habitat restoration is sort of this overarching term, and it means different things to different people. It means different things to different agencies, to different groups, and to individuals. So, the Forest Service in this case, when they talk about habitat restoration, they're talking about thinning out the forests and returning it, quote unquote, to a historical condition, where they claim that, these forests, particularly dry forests, were generally open, and, you could gallop a horse at full speed, through this open canopy. And there's actually there's a great paper by William Baker and Chad Hansen, 2023, which exposes the some falsification of information around these historical conditions in our western dry forests. So this narrative that our forests were open is, they were in places, but maybe 25% or so of the forest was open in some condition, but most of it was quite dense. And again, that's the habitat conditions that these animals evolved under. So, when the Forest Service talks about habitat restoration, they're talking about, thinning. They're talking about potentially, livestock grazing to reduce the quote unquote fine fuels, but actually livestock just end up disturbing the soils and introducing non-native plants like cheatgrass to take hold and completely changing the vegetation composition in these areas. The Forest Service likes to talk about these low-intensity fires that would frequently move through the forest, and that livestock grazing can mimic these fires by reducing grasses that these fires otherwise would have cleared out. And again, that's another area where it's just the science that the Forest Service is relying on has just been debunked. There's a very wide range of variability within fires. The fire rotation, how often they're coming through, the intensity of the fires. And they say that again, these low intensity fires came through quite frequently, and they did in places, but there were also areas that wouldn't have burned for many hundreds of years. And also you have this mixed intensity fire that happened all across the landscape, including those stand replacing fires. So you had low intensity, medium intensity, high intensity, and these really created those mosaics and patchworks of habitat types that all these species evolved under. And we have biological and evolutionary evidence for this as well. Species like the blackback woodpecker, specialize in living and feeding in these high intensity fire patches. So they were quite frequent, and the Forest Service, under all of it, they just want to prevent these trees from burning up, because if they burn up, then they can't use them unless they go in and salvage log them. But basically, they want to protect timber for the timber industry. That is what is really under all of this. So everything's just a pretense in order to either get timber out or to protect timber from burning up so they can get at it later. And then, of course, also to allow or promote the grazing of livestock in these places too.
What I think I'm trying to wrap my head around too is when we talk about the roadless rule and we have grazing that happens in some of these places, I would imagine we're not talking about them building roads for cows to go and find these places to graze, but they're in turn having access to these lands within this 58 plus million acre range to graze in these areas. Have there been effects already seen because of what's happening in some of these lands that are in the roadless rule? Or is this a prevention measure to try and make sure that doesn't escalate further than where it is right now currently, where we see cows grazing in these spots?
Yeah, it's really more of a preventative measure. Cattle do graze in wilderness areas too. People may not realize that,
right?
But
yes.
A large portion of our wilderness areas are grazed currently. Wilderness Watch did a report on this, and I don't want to say exactly what percentage of our wilderness is grazed, but okay, I'll take a guess, but I think it was like 25% or something like that.
Okay.
And I'd like to know the percentage of our roadless areas that are grazed as well. So you don't necessarily need roads to go into the areas. You just need them to be able to dump them off somewhere, and then you can herd them away, or the cows will just sort of drift out into these areas. And then range riders will, or cowboys or whatever, will go and gather them up and bring them back at the end of the season. But basically, public lands are used as like a babysitter, for cows. Your typical public lands rancher will release their cows out for the year. They don't check on them very much. The end of the year, they'll round them up, and then off they go to slaughter, or maybe back to the home ranch to be fattened up a little bit. But I'm not seeing, I don't know of any cases right now specifically where new roads were punched into roadless areas to facilitate grazing. But what's kind of interesting is it reminds me of the reason why the Gila primitive area, which became the first wilderness area in the United States, Aldo Leopold was then the assistant director for the Forest Service in Albuquerque. And cattle ranchers were proposing a road to improve grazing access into the undeveloped Gila headwaters. And Leopold wrote to the Journal of Forestry expressing this need for wilderness and for lands that are preserved in their natural state. So it's kind of interesting that grazing precipitated in large part this first real push by somebody to start advocating for wilderness. Fortunately, Leopold wrote in his proposal to the Forest Service National Office, and they started taking interest in that. And then the Gila wilderness was first designated administratively in 1924. but that also led to other early primitive areas like the Boundary Waters, the Grand Teton primitive area, the Three Sisters in Oregon. So that's sort of some of that early history. But I know of a lot of other situations where roads have been punched into areas specifically to get at the forage. So I could certainly see that happening more with the roadless rule being overturned. But also, a lot of these areas are remote. There's a reason why they haven't been logged up to this point. It's because they're hard to access. A lot of it is steep, but there certainly are, areas of forage that, cattlemen would want to get to. And there are plenty of trees that the logging industry wants to get to. There's a little part in a forest plan out of Southwest Washington, and it actually talks about some trees in an inventoried roadless area out there, and it says that I'm paraphrasing here, but it says that the timber industry has long coveted the large Douglas fir contained inside this roadless area. So, industry is certainly chomping at the bit to get into these places, whether it's timber, livestock, or mining.
What are the places that are most under threat at this point, as you just spoke about? So if there's a spot or two you're talking about grazing, mining, logging, what are the places that are most under threat at this moment, if we look at it, if we pull out to a macro view across, these three specific places where if the roadless rule is taken away, we're talking about these industries are going to be in there right away trying to get these resources?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'd have to just kind of think about this briefly. But of course, the Tongass National Forest that really comes to the top of mind for timber. It's an incredible old growth, large expanse of primeval forest up there, and the timber industry has been wanting to overturn the roadless rule in Alaska for a long time, and it was actually really close to happening, just a few years back. So the timber industry would love to get at the logs in the Tongass. As far as grazing, I could think of some areas like in the Wyoming range in Wyoming, where there would be some forage that they would want to get to. Throughout Utah, there's some roadless areas. So sort of that eastern edge where you've got that transition into the Great Plains. On those forests, there's quite a bit of forage that could be probably better accessed. In terms of minerals, I don't really, I know copper is a big one down in Arizona, and of course the Boundary Waters area. I don't know what the roadless situation is there. Of course, the Boundary Waters itself is designated wilderness. And then there's a lot of oil and gas in Colorado, for instance, so I can imagine some of those roadless areas. Actually, I know for a fact that some of those roadless areas have oil and gas that the industry would like to get to. So there certainly are some key examples around the country.
What is something with the roadless rule that I maybe didn't touch on, like something that you would want anybody who's listening to this to know specifically about either what are the safeguards there from the roadless rule, something that maybe we didn't touch on that you want to expand upon, right now that maybe we didn't get to? I know we talked a lot about fire, some of the safeguards, how expansive really this rule is across the country. What's something else that you want to bring up that maybe we didn't touch on in full that we can go into?
Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of it. But,
yeah.
When I think about roadless lands generally, these are just incredible places. Like they're every bit as high quality as wilderness in many situations, in most situations. I'd say half of my favorite places on public lands are within designated inventoried roadless areas. They don't have the same kind of appeal as a wilderness. But wilderness has kind of a marketable appeal. So, people don't visit roadless lands as much as wilderness, or at least they don't realize that they're visiting them. They don't seek them out. So they get less visitation. I find the wildlife habitat is top-notch in roadless areas. It provides that real safety for wolves and all sorts of different critters out there. So I think that, something that people should be thinking about is really the safeguards that these places provide for wildlife. And I would encourage folks to go out and find your local inventoried roadless area and to go explore, to get acquainted with it, and to engage in this upcoming public process. There's going to be a notice coming out in the Federal Register to, go through with this rescission process in the coming weeks. So I encourage people to get out there, to identify your local roadless areas, to explore them. And it's going to be hard not to fall in love with them. They really get under your skin. But I think that's really important right now for people to get that connection and to fight for these places, because if we do not fight for them, they will go away. Wildlife and wild places do not have their own voice. They cannot speak for themselves. So that is up to us to speak on behalf of these places.
I just have a couple more things for you, Adam. And really, this is great because it's good for me to get the knowledge and that we can put all this stuff out for everyone to hear on a large platform so that people can listen. Well, first, I want to know what's your favorite roadless area, if you want to disclose that. So what's the place that you call home, I guess, in that regard we spoke to early on in the podcast?
I have so many. Of course, I was going to say that, right?
Of course.
I'll just talk more broadly, but
sure.
Some of the roadless areas in and around the central Idaho wilderness areas are truly special. One of the photos that I sent you is me holding up a cutthroat trout, and that was caught in a roadless area. So that made me think to send you that one in particular. But I can't just pick just one. There's so many that I absolutely love and enjoy visiting. So I just can't pick my favorite one. But I encourage people to check out that map and to see what roadless is near you. There's also a lot of roadless lands that have not been actually inventoried. There were a couple of processes that happened after the Wilderness Act passed called the Roadless Area Review and Evaluation, number 1 and number 2, where the Forest Service was tasked with identifying roadless lands, but they dropped the ball both times. They were sued after number 1 by the Sierra Club, actually. But there are quite a bit of chunks of roadless that actually are not inventoried. So, and a lot of it is old growth and just incredible. So it's not just these places, again, that are inventoried, that have roadless characteristics that are certainly worthy of coming to know and to love and protect.
Absolutely. And we're going to have that map in the description. So anybody who's wondering where these places, the ones at least that are inventoried, excuse me, we'll have that in the description so you guys can look that over. Where, Adam, can people go to get sort of a baseline understanding of the Roadless Rule, where they can make an impact in their state at the level where they see fit, so that they can make sure that these places stay protected, they get involved, and they get informed about what's actually available in their region or in their state?
Yeah, so some of the larger conservation groups, like the Wilderness Society and Trout Unlimited, they've been putting out a lot of resources around the Roadless Rule, so you can go and learn, more specifics about them. I believe the Wilderness Society has a roadless map out there. Western Watersheds might as well. I'd have to double check if we have our own. But there's a lot of great resources through those organizations. Our organization is also involved with letter writing and organizing. We tend to get a bit more into the policy and kind of the behind the scenes stuff, meeting with members of Congress and rallying conservation groups to support stronger protections. So we don't have a real public-facing campaign, but some of the other conservation groups do. If I could, I also would like to mention the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which has been reintroduced into Congress. It would protect 23 million acres of roadless lands across Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Oregon, and Washington. So this was an incredible visionary piece of legislation. It's an ecosystem bill. It's the only one that's ever been put forward in Congress. And we need legislation like NAREPA, and we need it in other places of the country too, going forward. We really have to start thinking big and bold and starting to take actions that just go beyond these administrative protections, because again, we can see that they can just be overturned, administration to administration.
Right. And I just had a podcast with Lizzie Pennock discussing just that political yo-yoing, just in the protections with wolves on the ESA. And we know that doesn't really help the species in and of itself, and we know it won't help the land and the ecology and the environment if we keep going back and forth administratively. We need to have staunch protections for a lot of these places so that we can sit there and ground ourselves and get to a place where hopefully we find balance. My last question for you, Adam, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
When I think of wolf, I think of wildness. I think of intact ecosystems. I think of roadless lands. I think of wilderness. I think of untameness. I think of spirit of wild places. Wildlife like wolves really are the spirit and the soul of our wildlands. And wolves are incredibly important. They're native wildlife. They have every right to be here. They're inspirational, and I know, it's such a contentious topic, wolves, but I love having them on the landscape, and I think they're so important for ecosystems and for us as humans to have them out there. So those are my thoughts about wolves.
I love it. Adam Bronstein, thank you so much for taking the time, going through this whole thing with me, and all the work that you guys are doing at Western Watersheds to continue to fight for these lands that are everybody's. So appreciate you and all the knowledge that you dropped today. Really appreciate you, my man.
Hey, thank you so much for reaching out to us. And you can go to westernwatersheds.org if people want to learn more about our organization. But again, thanks for reaching out, John. It's been a great conversation. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much. Hang tight while we sign off. How's to you all out there? We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer. Thank you for listening.